Hello. My name's Matthew. I'm from School of Art Institute of Chicago, graduate student there. I suppose I'll just dive in from sort of the art making to the super art historical footnotes and all, so bear with me. In the history of critical art discourse, the writing hand has had a singular attachment to the seeing eye. This is particularly true in the continuum of modern art discourse, where the art object becomes a hub for multiple strains of philosophy and politics, eager to be seen and dissected. Here, the eye is valued as an organ for discernment, digging through layers of visual stimulus and representation in efforts to hook conceptual latches and forge meaning. Per Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the eye is an instrument that moves itself, a means which invents its own ends. In the 20th century, the eye became a methodology in and of itself, both channeling information and arranging it, cooperative with the textual creation of meaning and history. The predominant theories of modernist progression and regression value seeing as the fundamental act towards comprehending art and the world around it. Seeing then becomes not only a means of activating the artwork, but activating and enlivening one's own self. On the other hand, the ear has largely been maligned as a minor receptor of data, passive to the sounds of its environment. The canonical construction of art history largely ignores the ear and rarely offers sound the same critical platform as visual objects. However, with the emergence of sound art as a unique contemporary discipline, the ear has undergone reevaluation as not merely a passive organ, but as a dynamic creator of experience. Buttressing sound art as a gallery practice, whether inside its walls or out, several theorists and art historians have developed a phenomenological methodology that approaches sound as a critical and relational carrier of meaning. Works by Brandon LaBelle, Alan Licht, Douglas Kahn, Seth Kim Cohen, Paul Hegarty, and many others have created a new lexicon with which to describe and analyze sound. Furthermore, recent theoretical work by Nicolas Bourriaud and Jacques Rancière, though not explicitly associated with sound art, have provided a social and political framework with which to consider artwork done in sound. This new phenomenology stands in contrast to the eye-body-object constellation forged by Clement Greenberg, Rosalind Krauss, Merleau-Ponty, and their ocular-centric formalism. Such new language is necessary as the written word has a much more tenuous relationship with the ear than with the eye. Sound is nebulous and temporal, often escaping the grip of words. Where visual stimuli, and therefore visual art, has a special affinity with the psycholinguistic makeup of our writing brains, oral stimuli often refuses to be encapsulated and is rarely afforded a similar space for elaboration. This phenomenological shift is then not only a rewiring of art historical methodology, but of the listener-reader's brain. In order to parse apart the particularities of these two approaches, I'll set them against each other, both facing one artist in two works. Robert Morris's untitled Box for Standing and Box with the Sound of Its Own Making, both from 1961. I choose the work of Morris as a bridge point between the eye and the ear, with relationships of both canonical figureheads of visual minimalism, Donald Judd et al., and experimental music, John Cage et al. These two examples provide a convenient hub at which to compare and contrast phenomenological methods, one that continuously regenerates debate as to what precisely qualifies as sound art and not music or installation. Regardless of these controversies, over the past 10 years, sound art has arrived and matured as a practice distinctly within the gallery, absorbing various histories and controversies of that space. As such, listening in Kahn's sense of the word has become not only a way to echo the contours of history, but also the contemporary. Brandon LaBelle's Background Noise, Perspectives on Sound Art, begins as a history indebted to the work of Kahn, but develops the larger conceptual casting of contemporary sound practice. Taking cue from recent trends in site-specific and relational art making, LaBelle considers the formal manifestations of spatiality as the connective tissue between the histories of sound and visual art. He opens his book announcing, "It is my view that sound's relational condition can be traced through modes of spatiality, for sound and space in particular have a dynamic relationship." LaBelle makes no attempts to define the parameters of sound art. Instead, he works to describe sound practice as both sympathetic to larger trends in art making, but simultaneously of its own unique history and phenomenology. Ultimately, LaBelle's methodology is one of hybridization, drawing from visual disciplines and evaluation of oral ones, and vice versa. His positioning of Robert Morris epitomizes this approach. LaBelle contextualizes Morris, both historically and conceptually, with the 1958 translation of Maurice Merleau-Ponty's 1945 book, Phenomenology of Perception. Like Morris's early sculpture, Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology places the body at the center of experience and meaning, both performing in and reacting to the space around it. In the case of his 1961 work, entitled Box for Standing, the body in question is that of the artist. Constructed from the measurements of Morris's own frame, the work, quote, enacts the very space that surrounds the body and points to it as a performing subject, articulating and articulated by that space. As a simple wooden outline of the artist's body, the very absence of a body insinuates human form. Our coming into contact with the outline of absence prompts us to imagine its fulfillment. Furthermore, it proposes the body as a thing, much like the rectangular frame itself. The human body is not granted superiority or dominance over the wood that stands in its place. Similarly, Merleau-Ponty casts that the body is a thing among things. It is one of them. That circle around the body is an extension of the awareness of our own seeing bodies. Despite Box for Standing's lack of sound and the lack of hearing afforded by Merleau-Ponty, Lebel's project of hybridization draws both into the realm of sound art, conflating minimalist sculpture with the practice of listening, as both having, quote, relational interests in which the presence of a viewer or listener, an object or sound in the spatial situation form an extended conversation. As an object that does not make sound, it does not engage the ear. However, through its spatiality and relationality, it engages the eye and the body as if it were. Like Lebel, Seth Kim Cohen too approaches Morris as a bridge between the seen and heard. However, he does so not under the rubric of Merleau-Ponty, but rather Rosalind Krauss. Kim Cohen likens the aim of his 2009 book, In the Blink of an Ear Toward a Non-Cochlear Sound Art, in the process of categorizing sound practice, to Krauss's mission of, quote, sculpture in the expanded field. He says of Krauss, she came to this conclusion: an avenue of artistic practice does not depend on the exigencies of material. If the sculptor turns to materials never before employed in the production of sculpture, the right to call the work sculpture is not forfeited. Nor does the definition depend on a given mode of perception, a certain way of perceiving, or a set of accepted perceptual responses conditioned by that material. Speaking of sound art, he says, it turns out, is never simply it, if it is sound art. It must be distinguished from music on one side and gallery arts on the other. The borders are blurry, which means that the art itself is blurry. As a reaction to the blur, Krauss developed a schema of the expanded field, positioning the early work of Morris as being representative of a sculpture that had entered, quote, the full condition of its inverse logic, and had become pure negativity, the combination of exclusions. Sculpture, it could be said, has ceased being a positivity, a kind of ontological absence. In the physical and ontological absence for Box for Standing, the body of the viewer forms. This point is made clear when Krauss describes her reaction to the colossal work of Richard Serra. She says, his sculpture makes a viewer realize that the hidden meanings she reads into the corporate body of her world are her own projections, and that interiority she had thought belonged to the sculpture is in fact of her own interiority. Does sound do this? Can sound prompt such realization of the self? Can the field of sculpture be expanded beyond the visual? If Morris's Box for Standing encourages a realization of her body through sight, then his box with the sound of its own making does the same through sound. Created in 1961, Box with the Sound of Its Own Making consists of a 9-inch box encasing a small speaker, playing a recording made by the artist documenting the very creation of the box. As Box for Standing refers to the artist's body, so too does Box for Sound, through a heard reiteration of the artist's body in space. For Kim Cohen, this sculpture and the 3-hour recording of its fabrication extends Krauss's sculpture schema into the 4th dimension, time. Hearing the sounds emanating from the box, we are made duly aware of the box's immediate presence and the sonic history of its creation. Describing John Cage's inaugural interaction with the box in Morris's apartment, Kim Cohen says, the expanded situation in which Cage would have found himself would have been one in which he, the spectator, would shuffle back and forth in time between the time of viewing and listening and the time of making. As time progresses and the recording plays, Cage's and our own perspective shifts and the situation changes, promoting, like sculpture, not so much a stable and static site of contestation, but a dynamic and inconclusive situation. This inconclusive situation refers not only to our experience of sculpture, but to sculpture's very definition. This notion is foundational to Krauss's schema, where sculpture is, quote, only one term of the periphery of a field in which there are other, differently structured possibilities. Her appraisal of sculpture implies that the practice has charged ahead of the definition of the category, which must now play catch-up. Taking impetus from this, Kim Cohen develops his own schema of sound practice, a field that has likewise grown past the original confines of its definitions to create the expanded sonic field. As I noted, due to the conflation of sonic practice with gallery practice, the vernacular used to describe sound art has been built upon the foundations of visual art history. Moving from sculpture to sound art, though there is a phenomenological shift between the eye and the ear, the concepts behind this shift remain relatively the same. We can read this literally in Kim Cohen's adaptation of Krauss's schema, seen here. I lack the space to fully elaborate on the complexities of the schema and the artwork that it refers to. However, it is perhaps more important in the context of this paper and presentation to consider this schema as a symbol of sound art's phenomenology. The various categories of the expanded sonic field engage the body through the ear. However, sound may not always be used. Just as Morris's sculpture is a combination of exclusions per Krauss, so too can sound practice be an inverse of itself and not include sound at all. This is what Kim Cohen describes as a non-cochlear sound art, an art form that can present itself in any medium: photography, books, lines on walls, mirrors, sculpture, anything. Inclusive to an array of media, the expanded sonic practice is not strictly medium-defined practice, but a phenomenological one, wherein any material may be used to invoke response related to sound. Just as visual art is permitted to manifest itself as a negation of itself, so too is sound art. It deserves to be reiterated that this phenomenological overlap is currently being navigated by not only artists, but critics and historians as well. An enlightening recent example is the response to Susan Phillips, whose site-specific sound installations garnered her the 2010 Turner Prize. In December 2010, at the Tate Britain, Lowlands was exhibited, a work originally installed under 3 bridges in Glasgow, Scotland. Consisting of a layered recording of the artist singing traditional Scottish songs, the work is part music, sound poetry, installation, and public engagement with history. Writing for The Guardian, critic Adrian Searle, his reaction to Phillips's sound art recalls Krauss's reaction to sculpture, particularly that of Sarah, and the activation of her body. Her, Phillips, sense of place and space memory reminds me, this is Adrian Searle, weirdly of the sculptor Richard Serra at his best. Her art makes you think of your place in the world and opens you up to your feelings. And so Searle's ear is a discerning organ just as Krauss's eye. It is able to pierce through layers of representation to activate not only meaning, but a heightened experience of self. No longer the aforementioned passive receiver, the ear is entrusted to go out, collect data, and process it. Bringing back details of the artwork, yes, but more importantly, details about the listener.